A dusty night could only be made better with a cheap meal. That was the motto of people stuck in the Dust Bowl. For the struggling families of the time, cheap didn't mean tasteless. It meant survival. Curious to see what kept them going. Green tomatoes were something people ate really regularly. It was tough to grow much else thanks to all the havoc the Dust Bowl was causing on the environment, and by 1936, it was already a period of long-lasting drought and dust storms. Not exactly the kind of surroundings that inspire a lot of vegetable growth. People regularly were dealing with crop failure, and it meant that lots of families had their sources of food and livelihoods cut off from them. Green tomatoes, on the other hand, were one of the few vegetables that people had no issues growing. That's why they got as popular as they did, because eventually, people would begin to hoard them. You'd make basic things out of them like fried green tomatoes with cornmeal coating, but it was enough to last you through the day. Ripe tomatoes were in even shorter supply, and what was available was either rationed or taken up by people in urban centers. It was quite hard for any lasting stock of vegetables to reach people in rural areas, and it was often those people who had it the worst during the Dust Bowl. So, the cabbage was really similar. Basically, during the Dust Bowl, it was mostly a competition of how fast you could grow something and how conveniently you could do it. People weren't bothering with anything that took more effort than it was worth or didn't give immediate results. And honestly, I completely get them. Why would you waste your time on crops that are inherently difficult to grow when even the easy ones are going through so much crop failure? Cabbage was one of those easy-to-grow plants, and it became a national savior for lots of people. Cabbage stir-fry with onions and garlic was something people could enjoy every other day, as most of the core ingredients were things they had already been growing in their backyard gardens or preserving for a long while. At this point, the average American person is still used to keeping their experience with cabbage to just burgers, but the Dust Bowl pushed everyone out of their comfort zone just for the sake of survival. The Dust Bowl was hardship personified. Things like lentil and kale stew were honestly very necessary for the overall survival of people. Hearty greens like that would last, could resist the extreme weather and environment, and were most of all really nutritious. This was a time where you wanted to eat just about anything that strengthened your immune system. It wasn't just the lack of good food that was making it easier for people to get sick, it was also the lack of access to health care. People couldn't afford doctors, and the worst of the Dust Bowl hit all of the slums and rural areas that occupy the outskirts of so many states. This meant that a lot of lower and working class people regularly just ate so that the chances of getting sick were less and less, though despite their best efforts, they would eventually fall sick as well. Lentil and kale stew is as super as a food can get, and I mean that in every sense, but it's not an end-all be-all. What it is, though, is a very hearty stew that works great around the winter months for an entire family. You could spin this around a few different ways for variety, and it would still work, but the kids definitely had a tough time getting used to something like this. Can't really blame them either. I'm an adult, and I still struggle with kale. So if you go on over to the African American community during this time, especially in the rural South, then you'll find that a lot of them were introducing Americans to something new. Black-eyed peas and collard greens were a traditional pairing that was passed down in their community for ages, and it really pulled its weight for everyone throughout the Depression. Before all this mess had started, people weren't really too aware about the benefits of a black-eyed pea or how easy it was to grow. In fact, beyond navy and pinto beans, the average American didn't really think about what else was out there. Maybe the occasional split pea, but that's it. Collard greens still had a lot more of a reputation for being a super healthy dish you should always be eating, but it was hard to get the kids onto that kind of food. The hunger that most people would experience would push people out of their bubbles and have them eating anything available, though. Black-eyed peas were still one of the easiest things to grow, and it was especially popular throughout African American communities, even more so than usual. They had always made a lot of these, but now they were living by it too. One of the other things that was pushed to the mainstream thanks to the Dust Bowl was the reliance on one-pot meals. Stuff like vegetable pot pie with a biscuit crust really made the rounds just about everywhere. It was because it was so easy to pool together different kinds of vegetables to make one massive serving of pot pie, oftentimes more than just for a family. People would basically realize this. If they shared the amount of vegetables and resources they had, they could honestly make a lot more. Community-based ingredient sharing and food preparation once again became a thing. Entire neighborhoods were once again eating together, and it was a big part of how people managed to survive. This pot pie was a one-stop solution to massive amounts of hunger, and often people would throw in whatever kind of vegetables they had in there. This would typically look like your average mix of cabbage, onions, garlic, tomatoes, potatoes, and the rest, but people would try to add in aromatics to get some flavor going too. It was little stuff like this that really helped keep things together for everyone because, on their own, people didn't have the energy to cook big meals like this very often. Potato and chickpea curry with rice was a really good combination that was pretty much built for the environment people were finding themselves in the Dust Bowl. The recipe changed with each different area and state, but for the most part, the core mix of potatoes, dried peas, and rice was the same. People would substitute white rice with brown rice wherever they could because the latter was cheaper, and it made sense to stretch your pantries out as much as you possibly could. Potatoes, especially, were a rock-solid friend to rely on for the American people. They were one of the easiest things you could possibly grow. You could make so many things perfect for a large number of people with them, and they were full of health benefits. A side bonus was that they'd really keep you full, but all this should give you an idea. It was almost impossible to exist without having a good stock of potatoes in your root basement. Onions, garlic, a water-based broth, and just thyme and salt pepper were used for the curry. Pretty bare bones, right? Yet to them, that was still a phenomenal dish to come home to. Swiss chard is a leafy green we don't hear too much about anymore, and that was the case back then too. I don't blame people, since its glory days were definitely before the 20th century. But people remembered this little green once again during the Dust Bowl. People would pair this up with white bean soup, which was something that the masses found it very hard to live without. Why? They were a fabulous source of protein, they are affordable, you could even forage them, and these could actually be stored for months. This was a time where people were desperate for protein, by the way. A lot of good cuts of meat were more expensive than ever, and just out of the reach of most common people, while a lot of other kinds of things like nuts and almonds just weren't filling you up enough for the amount of money or time it would take to get enough of them. You had to be really smart with every cent, so people would go for things like white bean soup with Swiss chard. This was a versatile combination that had every pro health-wise on top of being something that could feed the entire family and be made with minimal effort. So the next thing on our list is baked turnips and cream sauces. But dear viewer, I know you aren't 5, and I know you're curious about how cream sauces could even be a thing in a time like this. After all, if people were struggling to get enough milk and eggs, where on God's green earth were they finding the money to get cream for? You see, my friend, there was a stark difference in lifestyles between two types of people. Those that grew up in the city and those that grew up in the countryside. Now, for the people trapped in those urban jungles during the Dust Bowl, I completely agree with you. Where did they get their cream from? For the ones living in rural shanty towns, though, well, you gotta know that they came from a long tradition of farming. A tradition that by the 1930s was still relatively upheld by most families. This meant that lots of these farming households had their own cattle and cows, and that's how they would get their milk and cream. Baked turnips, on the other hand, were something that was more commonly seen in the cities. It was, after all, something that primarily required an oven. In rural areas, it was a lot more common for people to pass the time with boiled turnips instead, but sometimes people would get lucky and find themselves having baked turnips along with a cream sauce to go with it. So we're going to go up to the upper class side of things for a bit. This wasn't a dish that anyone else could have afforded to make or eat back then anyway. Homemade gnocchi with noodles was still something that the relatively well-off and affluent families in the States were able to eat, and it was entirely something limited to certain parts of big urban hubs like Chicago, New York, and Washington. Gnocchi is an Italian dish, which I'm sure you already know. What's interesting is that it actually came on over to the States thanks to Italian immigrants, and back then, it hadn't become the fine dining appetizer that it's known to be today. It wasn't exactly that pricey either. Back then, Italian communities full of immigrants were still making it whenever they could. For the gnocchi, all you would need is flour, water, and dough. These were things that were out of the reach of normal people, sure, but to people with generational wealth? Well, it was mostly business as usual. Don't get me wrong, even though they were impacted by the recession and the Dust Bowl, there wasn't a single American home that wasn't. Did they draw the short end of the stick, though? Not by a long shot. This wasn't a dish you'd see anywhere outside of real bougie neighborhoods. During the Dust Bowl, one thing that was actually more common than you may ever think was lasagna with homemade noodles. Though of course, as with everything here, there is a catch. It's not the lasagna you're thinking of or the one Garfield's famous for falling in love with. Not anywhere close, no. It was instead vegetable lasagna, and the noodles were really DIY serviceable versions that just barely met the mark. It was such a disaster in Texas and Oklahoma, Kansas that people there were lucky to have anything even remotely resembling noodles still. After all, most of the stuff you'd use for homemade noodles was going through crop failure or food shortages. People really began to get into homemade noodles after they had a bit more experience growing food on their own, and when they could more reliably get potatoes out of their victory gardens. As far as the lasagna went, cabbages, spinach, carrots, kale, onions, broccoli, anything people had that was green would go in it. This was also a dish that inspired people to really take advantage of canned food too, and they definitely did by substituting a lot of root vegetables with canned goods. Don't get the wrong idea though, these were really makeshift versions of both dishes. It was nowhere near an actual vegetable lasagna either. It was more fitting to call it a lot of layered vegetables, really. Let's head on over to how people did things in the winter. Acorn squash with wild rice and herbs was one of the best holiday season combinations to have during all this mess, and that was for a few reasons. Wild rice was a regional thing. It was an important food source for indigenous communities that had long-held traditions around foraging and growing it. They knew what they were doing, so despite the toughness of the Dust Bowl's environment, they managed to get away with some amount of it. Herbs, on the other hand, were very bare bones. You had your pantry staples like oregano, mint, thyme, and parsley, but beyond that, you shouldn't expect much. Acorn squash was the real star of the show here. It could be used in a lot of things, but that wasn't what was special about it. This was one resilient crop. I mean, seriously, it barely failed. Comparatively to all the others, it seemed like squashes were still far easier to grow than most other things. It is only natural for people to then start adopting things like acorn squash with wild rice and herbs into their diet. They had already become a lot more familiar with wild rice than you'd expect, but dishes like these, especially in the winter, only hammered that appreciation home even more. So naturally, people did a few other things with kale than the ones we've gone over so far. One of those was a kale and chickpea stir-fry, which actually got a lot more positive PR than you would think. Seriously, before this decade, chickpeas never had this kind of clout. Suddenly, they were the Wagyu steak of America, though. It was all you ever really wanted to get your hands on. Kale was still something that was difficult for the American masses to consume regularly, but it was a work in progress. That stir-fry definitely made it a lot more digestible for most, and people didn't have the option of saying no based on their tastes. If it was there, and especially if it wasn't spoiled, you would suck it up and simply eat. What else were you to do? Turn down the perfectly good plate of food in the horrible, historically chaotic drought and recession going on? Plus, this was a good way to check off a lot of nutritional boxes that were otherwise going unfulfilled. While kale was a bit hard to get in some areas, typically ones that were farther away from markets, it was still something people got their hands on eventually, usually thanks to family. Chickpeas weren't that hard to get, and the rest was just a matter of getting on the stove and putting in the work. Which was really hard, mind you. People were exhausted. Similarly enough, people were having a lot of fun with all the different things you could do with celery. You could braise your celery with potatoes to have something resembling a home-cooked meal. It would often work too. Your knowledge of the Dust Bowl may be about its ecological extremes, though. I mean, it felt like that little chunk of the planet was throwing a generational hissy fit. What people did to cope with the trifecta of war, economic breakdown, and ecological disaster was a lot more interesting, at least to me. and hopefully to you too. Do you remember how I keep mentioning those backyard gardens people had? They were known as victory gardens, and the basic idea was to basically begin farming and planting crops on whatever fertile soil you had. Since potatoes were such an easy crop to grow, and since they could last in almost every kind of environment, it became really common for people to grow potatoes along with celery in these gardens. The end result was always a dish like braised celery and potatoes or mashed potatoes alongside celery, or a stew or broth. It was pretty efficient, and it would also double as trade for people, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in the next potato-based item. So it was exactly these gardens that would help people prepare for the next dish I'm going to talk about. During the Dust Bowl, vegetable stuffed zucchini would definitely seem like it was out of the reach of most. Vegetable zucchini actually used things like onions, tomatoes, and peppers, and that meant that you were eating pretty okay if you were stuffing it full of these things. The herbs were pretty much all homegrown too, and the beans. During the Dust Bowl, people were relying on whatever was available, so each serving of vegetable zucchini was vastly different than the last one. You'd take that and work with it, but people were really just making do with what they had. They'd throw in homegrown herbs if they could spare some, and some beans and peas. It would honestly be more of a meal than I'm making it sound. You should try vegetable zucchini sometime. Or if you have, did you like them? What was your experience like? Sometimes tradition would really come in handy. Okra stew with tomatoes and onions was a fine example of that. In southern US culture, it was really common for people to pass down recipes of this dish within their own families, especially in predominantly African communities. Still, okra stew wasn't exclusive to any one group of people. Even those who came from the Middle East or had Mediterranean influences were making it. The reason it was so good was because it was one of the few dishes people were having which actually still had some flavor to it. Most of the stuff I'm describing right now, you can literally count the amount of ingredients in it by one hand. Not only that, they're not really pairing it up with any kind of cream, sauce, or dressing, so there's just not a lot of room for flavor. Not much to do with seasoning either. It gets bland, it gets dry, and it gets hard to eat for the 50th time in the past 2 months. Okra stew with tomatoes and onions wasn't something that had this problem. You could use canned tomatoes, a vegetable broth, some garlic you grew in the backyard, dried oregano and thyme, some vinegar if you had it, and then that was it. It sounded simple enough, and in practice it was. But it was so much more than just a dish. It was a silver lining. Do you know that feeling of coming back home to your favorite leftovers? That's just a happy coincidence for us, but imagine that in a time where you barely eat or barely get to eat after a long day of work. Don't you think the feeling would hit that much harder? Barley risotto with mushrooms during the Dust Bowl was an interesting character study. On one hand, you had the middle class and below imitating risotto with barley, which made way for them to enjoy something that was typically reserved for the upper class. It was also one of the first few instances of people starting what would later become known as mock food culture. Do you ever hear about all kinds of mock apple pies, lasagnas, meatloafs? That was a series of recipes that were made with substitute ingredients, and the intention was to mimic the taste, texture, and feeling of otherwise popular dishes. It came out thanks to World War II, but I think the seeds were sown all the way before. Fresh mushrooms were hard, but it was still a lot easier to get wild mushrooms in the Dust Bowl. Eventually, people began to have a talent for foraging, and that was when the dish really came together on a regular basis for everybody. People started to make barley risotto thanks to these, and while traditional risotto was made with fresh mushrooms and arborio rice, people were making do with wild mushrooms and rice wherever they could. Baked bell peppers with millet filling is a pretty delicious and flavorful idea. It works well since millet is both cheap, versatile, and really good for you. Plus, it doubled as an option for people who had allergies to gluten. It's not often talked about, but living life with any kind of medical conditions becomes a real pain during times like these. Most people's response, hell, even the government's, is to make supplies and resources available for able-bodied people. On the other hand, bell peppers were something that people were still able to grow really easily around them whenever they found the chance to between growing celery and potatoes. Some common additions were things like garlic, onions, whatever you had been stocking up on growing beforehand. The best part about this dish was how it really boosted your energy for the day, which is something typically expected of spices. Still, it goes double for anything that's a stuffed bell pepper. It's a whole new experience, which, if you've had it, then you must be very familiar with the kind of zoomies I'm talking about. What's your experience with bell peppers like? Fried eggplants were another thing that people couldn't get enough of during then, especially with spiced tomato sauce. Like I said, it really took a lot of trial and error to find something that had enough flavor to it. This was something that people immediately knew was a gold mine of flavor, though. The eggplant was already spiced and it was pretty crispy from the frying. The tomato sauce on its own is tangy, which works really well with an eggplant. Still, if you choose to turn it up a notch further and make it even more spicier, then this dish is definitely for you. It also helps that it's completely vegetarian, and like I said, if you're anything but a conventional person, you'll find most relief efforts to not be very accommodating. That was true for people who didn't want to eat much meat, since it took a while for lots of vegetable-based recipes to pop up in mainstream spaces. There was the benefit of wasting no money on meat, though, since, comparatively, any kind of animal or meat was a lot more expensive than a vegetable. This dish worked for reasons like that, but it was also just something that really kept you full. You had a lot of fiber and a lot of vitamin C, and I'm sure I don't need to explain how living in a chronic dust storm can be bad for your skin. Cabbage steaks with garlic sauce were another example of that mock food culture I was talking about. So that's definitely a bit of a stretch when it comes to what exactly can classify as an imitation and not just flat-out blasphemy. Cabbage steaks actually did end up coming close, though. People got really creative during the Dust Bowl because of how they just had nothing to work with. Poor harvests full of failed crops, scarcity, and just the general circumstances of every average day were really pushing them to their limits. Still, what hit really badly wasn't how hard everything was, but how rare the normal things had become. A good steak, chicken nuggets, some nice hash browns, a good Christmas, stuff like that. It was these little everyday joys that completely went out of people's lives that made the biggest difference. This is also exactly why people began to imitate things like steaks. Cabbage steaks were really thick slices of cabbage, so they'd have a bit of a weighty bite to them, and then they would be roasted and grilled until they were crispy. Then people would make a garlic sauce with it and serve it as is. The sad part of this whole thing was that cabbage steaks were honestly just something that the people living with ovens could afford. You needed to preheat the oven for this and use baking paper, which weren't things that people were able to spend their money on. Parsnip and lentil stew was a really good dish. It had the earthiness of parsnips, which were a common thing to grow and buy in farmers' markets and grocery stores. And then you also had lentils. This was a lot better than the potato soups people had become accustomed to all the time while they were trying to make the day go by. It was rustic, nutritious, and it actually was the perfect thing to eat when it was cold. During the winter, it became so hard to afford to spend money on any kind of heating arrangements or winter shoppings. Parsnips and lentil stew was also a vegan-friendly meal, and if you think they hold on to their recipes now, you should have seen them back then. Man, nobody made life easy for them. The best thing about this stew was that you could adapt it to whatever it was you had on hand and could work with. Whether that was medium carrots, celery, tomatoes and onions, or chicken broths and herbs, it would work. All you had to do was adjust to taste, and you were ready to go. It was best to eat this warm, though it wouldn't really work well as a leftover meal. That's why people never made it in bulk unless they were cooking for the entire neighborhood. Collard green wraps with black beans and corn is a pretty loaded dish, especially for Dust Bowl era standards. Where do we really start here? The greens weren't really that available throughout the Depression and Dust Bowl. It was because dried beans and corn were a staple in so many houses that not many could snatch them up for themselves. There was always a decent amount of people that were either too late, couldn't go, or just got unlucky. Corn wasn't that much of an issue, given how easy it was to grow, and how just about everyone became really good at growing it. Black beans were harder to come by, though. Still, when people did get it, they would definitely take advantage of it with this recipe. Collard greens and black beans were also. If you really wanted to get fancy with it, Technically, some people did add bits of leftover meat or ham and potatoes to it. They would also add in some ground meat, some rice, quinoa, or whatever else they were working with. Anything that would make the filling, well, more filling was good. It helped to have a dish like this because it reminded people of the times they were able to go out for a night on the town and eat good food. So, the next thing we have is roasted carrots with parsnips and herb butter. Now, I know you've heard a lot about how butter was barely available during the Depression, and especially the Dust Bowl. Herb butter, on the other hand, is a bit different from the traditional butter you've heard about. This is also a pretty standard custom that's existed throughout the history of the United States, especially in communities like the Native American ones. What really is it, though? Herb butter is basically just butter mixed in with a cocktail of different herbs. You put in basil, parsley, thyme, oregano, basically anything and everything you have. It's been a thing for people who had access to gardens or farming land, and a lot of rural areas would also grow loads of herb butter. This is because they already had space to grow so many herbs that herb butter was simply the next step on the road. This is pretty much one of the best ways you can enjoy your butter, as it really adds an entirely new world of flavor to just about whatever it is you're making. This is even more true for something like roasted carrots and parsnips. I mean, let's be honest, the roasting definitely helps, but it's not like we're working with a lot of flavor here. Homemade spatzel with buttered cabbage was a wonderful little meal that was perfect during the Dust Bowl for a few reasons. It was perfect for people who came from other countries to settle down in America, like the Germans and a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe. It was a dish that was basically just an egg noodle, popular in lots of European cuisines. Despite how it sounds, it really was just an everyday meal, and a pretty good one at that. For this, all you would need is flour, eggs, and water, and sometimes milk. That alone put it out of the price ranges of many, but the ones that could afford to move and settle down in one of the frontline countries of the world could definitely afford their flour too. Buttered cabbage was something that was a lot cheaper to get. People would make those DIY homemade noodles we talked about earlier and pair it up with buttered cabbage when they couldn't get the other ingredients. It was a feel-good, comfort food type of meal that brought some joy back into people's day as they ate. So, by now, it wasn't really too common for vegetable kebabs to be a thing in the States yet. They hadn't made their mark, especially by the Dust Bowl era, but some families that did come from Middle Eastern backgrounds made use of their backyard gardens to make this dish. Those families were few and far in between, which is why the recipe hadn't really seen mainstream success just yet, but lots of people adopted it anyway because of one simple fact. You could cook this over an open fire, and the grilled onions people would pair with it were just perfect. If families did have any kind of access to meat, then they used it here. Little chunks of beef were preferred, but even chicken would do. The best part about these was how you could make them with just potatoes and still come out with a wonderful dish. Speaking of potatoes, remember how I talked about how people traded them? When they weren't making soups, casseroles, and kebabs out of them, people used their backyard produce for bartering. Although entirely an ages-old concept, bartering for things made a return throughout the 1930s thanks to how bad things got. Money really wasn't worth anything more, and people thought it was better to just trade for things you needed. The last thing we have on our list is boiled turnips with butter sauce. Again, this is something we went over earlier. Most places really couldn't afford ovens, so the popular thing to do was to definitely boil your turnips instead of anything else. The butter sauce was a humble little typical sauce made with herbs and butter that added some smoothness to the turnips. For what it was worth, it did have a better texture. Overall, this dish was just a little comforting breakfast for most people. It wasn't exactly anything that would really fill you up, but it was a good way to start the morning. The sauce had some real oomph to it, and the boiled turnips, although a bit chewy, were something that kept people's appetites down for a while. So most oatmeal meatloaf recipes use the oats as a side piece to, like, 2 pounds of lean ground beef, but that was obviously not what people were working with back then. Instead, the loaf was made entirely of layers of oatmeal, with sausages and bacon stuffed into it to give that meaty profile. Some dried onions and garlic meant that there was good enough reason to get the fine plates out, and there was always enough to go around too. Plus, grandmas really ran with the recipe right after the Depression ended and things started going back to normal. They would add things like tomato sauces and never spare the eggs or the flour. Probably why kids would love it so much since they went all out with it. But after going through a patch where this was a luxury, you cannot blame them for wanting to go the extra mile either. We're going to go forward in time a bit, all the way to the beginning of what most people consider the late 20th century, where stuffed zucchini boats first started becoming something you would hear about regularly. You know, at bars, from your friends and colleagues, or your partners. They became really hot in the 60s and 70s when it felt like everyday people were trying another dish from a new country that hadn't really touched base in America yet. It was the first time people expanded their taste buds beyond the bacon, pancake, and hash brown breakfasts they were mostly used to. Plus, stuffed zucchini boats were really healthy. They were a lot better to eat than those aforementioned breakfasts. The best part was that you could really change up the fillings, so depending on what you wanted, you could have fully vegetarian zucchini boats or ones with ground beef stuffings. People say this is a part of Italian-American cooking, but a lot of Mediterranean cooking makes use of dishes similar to zucchini boats, like using stuffed peppers and vegetables like eggplants. It was rare to get protein from actual meat during that period, but that didn't stop people from fulfilling their cravings by dabbling in mock cuisine, such as the popular mock fish fillet. While this did not actually use fish, it imitated the texture and flavor with pints of milk brought to boil, ground rice, chopped onion, and leeks, with the end being a good stir in a properly beaten egg. What you had was an excellent mimicry that felt close enough to the real thing while being distinct and offering a new experience. Nowadays, this recipe is used in vegan communities, but its origins come from very anti-vegan places, and it would be a great substitute for actual fish and chips as well. Yes, you heard it here first, skunk stew. Even when the Dust Bowl left dinner plates empty, people were not the only ones who could not escape being eaten. Not even skunks. Now, before you start gagging, let me explain. Skunks were not the preferred source of protein, but when the resources were scarce, the farmers made do with whatever they could hunt down. Cooking skunk stew was not for the faint-hearted. First, you had to, de-skunk the skunk. It was mandatory to have the scent glands removed unless one wanted the house cleared faster than a tornado. After washing, it was cooked with what vegetables and spices were available. The result? A rather soft and gamey meal that was palatable though, but not one that would make me eagerly look forward to the next meal. Skunks may sound like the butt of some jokes, but these animals were a good source of protein food when all else was scarce. And can you imagine? A skunk was not as smelly as other wild games like raccoon or possum. Talk about a backhanded compliment. While skunk stew appears to be the epitome of the challenge-accepted food that is popular today for the survivors of the Dust Bowl, it was a symbol of survival. They made desperation into dinner. As they say, where there is life, there is a chance to live, and sometimes to live, you have to eat the wild, literally. In Texas, as well as New York, rice with raisins started becoming a really popular dish among the middle class and a breakfast that many children grew up on. Especially in Indian American communities, which were sparse at the time, but they were still there every other block or two. It was already customary to eat rice with milk and raisins there, so they brought it to America, and others took note. They were not the only ones to introduce it, though, since Chinese Americans also had their own take on the recipe that led to a more custard-like variant. When people could not afford to even eat rice pudding, they would make their rice and eat it with different kinds of nuts and raisins. The idea spread like wildfire in states like Alabama and Arkansas and the Midwest overall. In Michigan, it was a pretty common choice to use brown sugar and cinnamon whenever available. Hoppin John is a dish that has some pretty rich heritage. I'm talking about African, Caribbean, and Native American roots that all boil together in the melting pot known as the South, where it first started becoming really trendy. However, the origins of the dish are actually a bit darker than just a happy coincidence that somehow got into everyone's table. Though the people who were eating it happily wouldn't know, it was first created and brought over by enslaved Africans in the American South. It made use of African rice and pork, And yes, the best part of the dish were the black-eyed peas even in those times. Now, as far as the name Hoppin John is considered, nobody really ever knew where it first came from, or if there was a John who made this dish and brought it into everyone's lives. But the first time this name was mentioned was in the 1840s in a print. If you were down in the South and African American communities during New Year, then you would especially see a lot of Hoppin Johns everywhere. The aroma of those peas and the smoked pork wouldn't miss anyone's nose, as the scent carried for miles and miles away. It was eaten specifically on New Year's because it was a common belief that eating Hoppin Johns would bring good luck to people if they ate it to start the year. If you went into any new year with such a good plate of food, I'd say your luck was already pretty good. So maybe it does work? Who says you need apples to make an apple pie? Not the Depression era, folks, that's for sure. This mock apple pie was a genius hack that used Ritz crackers as the crust and a sweet, sticky filling made from sugar, cinnamon, and water. It was a budget-friendly dessert that satisfied the sweet tooth without the need for expensive or hard-to-find ingredients. Plus, it was a great way to use up those stale crackers lurking in the back of your pantry. The Ritz mock apple pie became a Depression-era favorite, despite the fact that it was a pastry imposter. How did it work? The aromatic mixture of sugar, cinnamon, butter, lemon juice, and crackers combined to convince the taster's senses that the pie actually tasted of apples. Mock apple pie actually dates to the mid-1800s. During the wintertime, when apples were scarce and dried apple stores were used up, inventive home cooks would instead use soda crackers or stale bread. The more modern Ritz cracker version came about in the 1930s. Bubble and squeak was something that completely fit the situations most people would find themselves in during the war, because this dish is all about the leftovers. Usually, Sunday dinner's leftovers would be used in a bubble and squeak to make sure nothing went to waste. Plus, people would definitely take that sentiment to heart when it came to holiday dinners where there were enough things left to constitute at least 2 or 3 meals the next day. Usually, this dish is made with potatoes and cabbage and is fried, so it goes properly and amazingly with some potato flatties or other items on the list. Maybe you can take a note from people's books the next time you think you have nothing to eat, but plenty of things still left in the fridge. If you always believed that only the drippings can be used to make gravy, then you are wrong. Blood gravy was a Dust Bowl staple that created a meal from the most unappetizing of ingredients, animal blood. Sound intense? It was. But back then, farmers couldn't afford to waste a single drop, literally. Blood gravy was produced by drawing fresh blood from animals, particularly pigs or cows, and then mixing it with flour, milk, and spices to make it into a thick paste that was served as a relish. Served over biscuits or potatoes, it was rather tasty and rich in nutrients, which came as a complete shock. During a period when people suffered from a lack of iron, blood gravy was, in fact, a sort of multivitamin. This dish was both a product of ingenuity and the expenditure of a considerable amount of effort. Getting the blood was not easy, but the meal was filling. For today's food lovers, it may be hard to swallow, but blood-based recipes are not something new to the culinary world, since there is blood pudding from Sweden and dinuguan from the Philippines. Would you try it? Seriously, I can take it if it's presented on a fluffy biscuit, and if it's well seasoned, I might be willing to try it. Dust Bowl cooks were masters of turning nothing into something, and blood gravy is a perfect example of that adage. Comfort food in the 1940s could not be discussed without somebody bringing up American slumgullion. This was really hot in the Midwest and the South, mostly by its other name of goulash. The dish has been in recipes and cookbooks since at least 1913, and it would include ground beef simmered in a tomato sauce. It was a dish for nights that you really wanted to make matter, and it was also a great way to keep the nutrition and protein intake up. Think of it as like a kind of casserole, and if you have heard of it before, you should know the 1930s versions were a bit different. These ones involved no pasta or macaroni or cheese. Those would become staples of the dish much later on, and we have grandparents to thank for that too. Brown betties were one of the most classic American desserts to ever grace the table of an American kid. Something that might be seen as an old-fashioned dessert now, but used to be the next best thing after an apple pie. The flavors of a brown betty usually come from the spiced apples and other fruit-layered dishes, which are really buttery. The sugary breadcrumbs on top give it a crunch, which really adds to the entire vibe of the brown betty. You're looking for a warm, comforting dish that gets you in a nostalgic mood. Something you can sit down with and enjoy bite for bite, not rush through. It's an experience that you want to savor, like an empty, windy street as you walk down by and enjoy it. The brown betty was definitely something that would get you up out into the street, whether you were going to visit your grandma's for an authentic pie or a nearby bakery to reminisce about childhood days. The earliest recipes you can find are the ones from 1866, but those are more like apple betties than the ones we're talking about. Either way, this dish has definitely evolved alongside the population, and those who grew up with it will remember it fondly. Up next, we have a dish that was all about making the most out of simple ingredients: spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole. It can be argued that Eleanor Roosevelt did the best she could during the Great Depression. The First Lady promoted dishes to encourage savvy homemakers, such as a casserole made from spaghetti, boiled carrots, and a simple white sauce of milk, flour, salt, and butter. The spaghetti had to be cooked for 25 minutes. The idea was to get the noodles mushy so they paired nicely with the boiled carrots and a penny's worth of creamy sauce. The result? A vehicle for nutrition and nutrients. Families loved this dish because it was versatile and could easily be modified based on what was available. It was a great way to fill up hungry bellies without breaking the bank. It still makes a pretty delicious meal for potlucks, so if you want to impress everyone with something easy to whip up, the spaghetti, boiled carrots, and white sauce casserole will do. If people can make an entire fake fish fillet and still be pretty satisfied with it, then other meaty wonders like liver definitely are not too far off the horizon, and chopped liver substitute would eventually prove that right. Something that became incredibly popular in the war-torn landscape of America because all it took was some onions, green lentils, walnuts, and salt and pepper. You had to make a paste out of it to get the texture of chopped liver down, and in terms of taste, this was a completely new experience, yet a significantly cheaper and easier one. It was much easier to get ingredients like these than good quality liver back then, and a lot of citizens stuck with this recipe even after the dust settled because they liked how healthy of an alternative it was. If you believe that eating insects is a modern sustainable practice, you are wrong. In the Dust Bowl, crispy fried grasshoppers were not a joke, they were a staple food. During the poor harvests, and when meat was hard to come by, farmers looked to the hordes of grasshoppers feeding on the crops. Talk about revenge dining. Hunting grasshoppers was a family event, and when you had gathered enough grasshoppers in a bucket, then the cooking process started. They were washed, marinated, and then fried to a crisp golden brown. The result? A crunchy snack that contained protein and was not too shabby if one didn't consider what they were consuming. Grasshoppers are in fact a form of superfood as they contain high protein, iron, and good fats. The Dust Bowl families were not consciously trying to innovate, but they were able to feed themselves in a way that many others could not. Also, if you fry anything, it automatically becomes at least 50% tastier, doesn't it? Nowadays, insects are being considered as a source of food, but in the past, crispy grasshoppers were a means of feeding oneself. Potatoes had more use than just what was under all the layers. Once peeled, people would often fry the potato skins as a midday snack. Nothing would ever go to waste in homes back then, as you must have gathered by now. If they can make stuff out of sausage drippings and drain the fat from bacon to reuse, frying up some potato skins does not seem that out of the box at all. These fried skins were the perfect sidekick to potato pancakes, and the fact that the skins had a lot of health benefits made it all the more appealing. Things like this really helped to keep appetites in check, and that meant that the financial situation of the home would be calmer too. Are you a big fan of deli food? Deli meats, sandwiches, loaves, that kind of thing? Then one of the best parts of that kind of eating was the olive loaf. It was usually made with pork and beef plus chopped green olives, which is what it became known for. There was a small, brief period before convenience foods started taking over America, where processed meats were really becoming a thing, and this dish was a big part of that time, which arguably spanned all over the 1940s to the 1970s. It had an extremely loyal fan base too, as this was responsible for many deli counters still staying in business. These days, you could find retro stalls that still do a mean olive load, but the days where this was a commonplace item on the street and something you'd see your grandma cooking up are long gone in America's history. People definitely remember the flavors of the bologna, the ham loaves, and all the amazing dips they came with, though. So, peanut butter stuffed baked onion might sound strange, but trust me, it's worth a try. We're taking a whole onion, hollowing it out and stuffing it with peanut butter. Then, we're going to bake it until the onion is caramelized and sweet. It sounds like an odd pairing, but the salty, creamy peanut butter and the sweet onion actually complement each other really well. This dish was a unique way to combine protein and vegetables. It might not be everyone's cup of tea, but it was a clever way to make a filling meal out of inexpensive ingredients. Plus, onions were a staple in many households because they were stored well and added flavor to almost any dish. It was one of the more outlandish food recipes to come out of the Great Depression, and food historians Andrew Coe and Jane Ziegelman, authors of A Square Meal, are certainly no fans. So am I. You might think that boiled animal hooves are something that only a survivalist would eat, and indeed, during the Dust Bowl, they were the only thing keeping some families going. When meat became unaffordable and gelatin packets were a luxury, hooves came in handy, literally and metaphorically. Animal hooves, preferably cow or pig, were used and boiled to make a broth that was as useful and as ugly-sounding as it can get in our ears today. The long cooking process tenderized collagen present in hooves and made it into a natural binder for soups, stews, and even sweets. Yes, you heard it correctly, desserts. Gelatin from hooves was the secret behind the wobble in aspics, jellies, and custards. This was not about getting by. It was about getting the most out of each part of the animal. Hooves cooked were a rich source of protein and minerals and were a great food source during the lean periods. And even though they were not the most attractive, they ensured that bellies were filled and bodies were built. Today, such concepts as boiling hooves may cause some people to have goosebumps. However, in those days, it was business as usual. Dust Bowl meals were about subsistence, and at times, subsistence entails getting creative with what is available, or hoof. Back in the day, when you were out of just about everything except sugar, flour, and fruit, a vinegar cobbler was your only option. No surprise that it was also known as one of the famous desperation pies. Desperation pies are pies in American cuisine made using staple ingredients like butter, sugar, eggs, flour, and any other ingredients that cooks had on hand to complement them or substitute for ingredients that were out of season or too expensive. These pies were more common before refrigeration and canned pie fillings, and during times of hardship like the Great Depression and rationing of World War II. When fresh fruits were hard to come by, people turned to vinegar to mimic the tartness of fruits like apples and lemons. This cobbler used a mixture of vinegar, sugar, and spices to create a filling that, when baked, tasted surprisingly similar to a fruit cobbler. Instead of chunks of fresh apples, those on a budget would use apple cider vinegar to fake the acidic taste. The crust was made from basic pantry staples like flour, sugar, and butter or lard. The dish reportedly tasted like a custard made from salt and vinegar chips, a rare dessert that leaves the roof of your mouth tingling. What's for dinner? Oh, just a small something that came in from the backyard. Yes, the tumbleweed casserole was a real dish during the Dust Bowl, which just goes to show you that when the going gets tough, the tough make casseroles out of tumbleweeds. Tumbleweeds, those rolling shrubs of the Wild West screen, are actually technically, or at least partially, edible. Not fancy for the tongue, but we are hungry to the bone. Let's give it a try, edible. The process began with the boiling of the tumbleweed leaves to reduce their coarse feel and also to reduce the bitterness of the leaves. Then they'd get layered with whatever ingredients were available, maybe some scraps of meat, potatoes, or canned goods if you were lucky. The result? A surprisingly substantial, earthy-flavored casserole that was as much about sustenance as it was about taste. Tumbleweed is very fibrous and even has a few vitamins in it, so it wasn't the worst thing to eat when fresh greens were scarce. Moreover, tumbleweeds were free and easy to come by, nature's grocery store, if you will. Though you'll never see it on the dinner table. Tumbleweed casserole represents Dust Bowl endurance. Would I eat it? Well, I'd need a serious pep talk and a lot of seasoning. But hey, if the tumbleweed can take the hot winds, then it should not be a problem on my plate. Okay, this one is a bit of a curveball. Cold milk soup? But hey, desperate times call for desperate measures. Cold milk soup was a Depression-era staple, and it's exactly what it sounds like. This dish has Amish origins and was one of the most popular meals back in the day. It was also pretty simple to whip up. Take some milk, mix in sliced bananas, a bit of sugar, and sometimes even bread or other fruits. And there you have it, cold milk soup. It might not sound like much, but for many families, this was a quick and easy way to get some calories and nutrients, especially when fresh ingredients were hard to come by. The bananas added some natural sweetness, while the milk provided protein and fat. It was a simple, no-cook meal that could be thrown together in minutes and was perfect for those hot summer days when turning on the stove was the last thing you wanted to do. This recipe really made a name for itself during the mid-1930s to 40s when people were facing a dire shortage of eggs. Still, if you did not have even some potatoes on hand but still wanted a pancake to cheer your kids up, you would go for eggless pancakes. Some shortening, sugar, milk, and salt were all you needed to make this version of the beloved American dish, plus just some water to bind if you could not find any milk to spare. Lucky were the homes that had lard, as that really made for some fluffy and thick cakes, but complaining was not really something people did during those times. A simple recipe like this let them revisit the taste of pancakes from back when they had fully stocked fridges, after all. Spiedies are also something you would find at gatherings for family or just friends, mostly because no party is complete without a good platter of meat skewers going around a few drinks. So, mostly people would enjoy these most when the meat was lamb, but some areas like California would use chicken or beef too. It was really the grilling where the magic happened. These plates of Spiedies set the mood in a party alight. It was a taste that, when they experienced it, people at a party knew that they were in for a really good time. The kind of dish that gets a crowd excited and hungry. There were even Spiedefests in Binghamton and all around New York in general. It was a part of the local culture that no big celebration was really complete without. The reason it got popular wasn't just because of a regional preference in New York, though. The dish was bold, tangy, and citrusy, and it could double as an amazing sandwich too. You would find these in street stalls throughout New York, as well as at homes, but nowadays the dish has faded away into irrelevance. If you are considering giving up Starbucks as a hardship, just try making your coffee out of these plants. Dandelion coffee came into existence during the Dust Bowl when people could not afford coffee beans and other products. That's right. Those yellow flowers that appear on your lawn in spring and are so annoying once provided the means to satisfy caffeine cravings at the survival level. For it, people would uproot dandelions, bake the roots until they were black and toasty, and then pulverize them into a brew. There was no sugar or cream, just the natural taste of roasted roots. It was not as strong as real coffee, but it provided people with something warm to drink in the mornings when they were unsure about the future. Moreover, dandelions were free and easily available, no need to go to Starbucks. To the chagrin of dandelion coffee, it is now considered a health drink. Rich in antioxidants, it is believed to have liver benefits and can be found at health food stores for a hefty price. It was not about the latest fad diet or the newest way to live a healthier lifestyle. It was about not going insane without your cup of coffee in the morning. I can't help but wonder how the farmers of Dust Bowl must have been feeling sipping on this dandelion brew and hoping for a better tomorrow and a decent cup of coffee. Now it is a retro chic beverage, while back then, dandelion coffee was a means of getting back to the normal, even if the normal tasted like the grass one mows. Green tomato pie is something that'll have you running back for seconds. First off, you gotta hand it to whoever made this dish for their ingenuity. It's not every day you get a banger of a dish that actually is centered around making the green tomato shine out of everything else, but Southern home cooking will do that for you. Charlotte's green tomato pie in particular makes use of some typical southern spices like cinnamon and nutmeg and unripened green tomatoes, and has you making a pie that'll rival even the best apple ones you could find at bakeries. Green tomatoes have an especially great harvest during the fall, so that's when this dish would see the most mileage. You would find houses all over the South constantly making green tomato pies, and this specific pie is an example of how you don't need anything fancy to create something that can get everyone at the table. You know what's even funnier? This dish is one of the best things to come out of mock cooking because it was made to imitate mock apple pie and mincemeat pies. An imitation of an imitation ends up giving us something that was a big part of Southern culture. Who would have thought? Oatmeal went out the window and cornmeal came in, especially as the base of dishes like Johnny cakes, which were the cravings of everyone. They were made from fried cornmeal gruel, hot water, salt, or sweetened milk if it was available. People used a specific kind of pan to make these too, and it was known as a spider pan. Essential to the Johnny cake experience was keeping a very watchful eye on them to ensure the crisp did not burn, as well keeping a constant supply of bacon fat. That was another thing that got popular as people would store the fat from strips of bacon up and use it in dishes like this. In half an hour, you had a pretty decent lunch made with some pretty bare-bones ingredients. So braised beef tongue might be something you are not used to hearing, and the idea of beef tongue in general might be icky to some. Still, keep your minds open because the people back then definitely had to, and what they found out was that it is not so bad. Maybe you might be in for a culinary shakeup too? Either way, braised beef tongue was quite a popular dish that would typically be served in a casserole-like manner during World War II. Due to the war, it was very difficult for families to acquire the meats they were typically used to having, and beef tongue was rubbery and tough, but it was the best they could get. Braising it made for a softer bite and a lot of flavor, so you had all your protein and nutrition needs ticked off cheap and easy. That was a lot more than you could expect during wartime. Next up, a dish that sounds almost too simple to be true: tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. I know, it doesn't exactly scream gourmet, but remember, we're talking about a time when people were just trying to survive. This combo was a way to stretch those precious few ingredients. During the Great Depression, potatoes were a cheap and filling staple, and tomato sauce was an easy way to add flavor. This dish was essentially a plate of creamy mashed potatoes topped with a savory tomato sauce. It might sound a bit unusual, but this combination was a hit because it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. Plus, potatoes were versatile. You could mash them, fry them, or bake them depending on what you had. So, if you're ever in the mood for a simple yet tasty meal, try tomato sauce with mashed potatoes. Let's see if this humble dish can impress our modern taste buds. Think of a crispy and tender potato cake that has the perfect crunch to it too, and you have yourself a potato flatty. Potatoes were an ingredient that the horrendous war had not taken away from people, along with other basic necessities like wheat. So dishes involving potatoes saw a huge increase in popularity, and some rather forgotten ones like potato flatties got a whole new chance at life. Originally, it is popularly believed that canal workers came up with this oldie but goldie dish when they would cook grated potatoes over fires until they were golden brown. Whether they did invent the dish or not, it definitely was a comfort food for masses everywhere, and we can easily see why too. Considered classic 40s junk food, we would love to try a good authentic potato flatty today. Now here's something that started out in the bleakest of times but quickly became a sensation throughout America even after the Great Depression ended. You can't ever beat a fried bologna sandwich. I don't care what uptown neighborhood and what fancy restaurant you've been to. Something about that mix of bologna with cheese, mayo, and sometimes even bacon and sausages is unbeatable. It was something that was incredibly beloved by the public right after the Second World War ended, and the Midwest in particular couldn't really ever get enough of it. Diners, homes, rural areas, local breakfast joints, everyone was serving an affordable fried bologna sandwich. It was something you could rely on to both satisfy your taste buds, get you a healthy dose of protein, and not break your wallet if you had it daily, which was really asking for a lot in those times. Cornmeal mush is usually made with water or milk and is a type of pudding or porridge depending on the needs of the meal. This became incredibly widespread in the southeastern and eastern bits of America, and it makes sense given how much wartime rations were consumed there. When the government would hand those out, they would often make a point to lower sugar usage and use molasses to conserve other ingredients, so people would pair cornmeal mush along with them. Mush is a more accurate term since it does kind of land somewhere in the middle ground between a pudding and a porridge. It has the consistency of the latter, but it gels and sets like the former, which gives it a slightly airy texture too. Did you know it would not be cooked in milk though? That was set after the mush was prepared to cool it down. I don't need to tell you about how much America and the West in general love rice pudding. It's been something that's helped rural and urban populations get through some disastrously tough times, as well as a warm memory from childhood for a lot of people. One variation of the classic rice pudding was a Swedish rice ring, which would mostly be served at Christmas or a family get-together, but it eventually extended into daily use too. The dish first started off as something you'd only find in Scandinavian communities, and they'd really make heaps of the stuff. Enough to go around a big family of 6 or 8 with a bowl for each, and it makes sense too since it was made using some pretty average ingredients. Stuff like rice, milk, and cream were all you needed to get a Swedish rice ring going. The way it differed from normal rice pudding is in how the dish was originally always made with some kind of spice and topped with fruit or served alongside jam. Later on, when it expanded past the Scandinavian locale and got adopted into widespread use, people started using nutmeg and cinnamon as well. Some scant cookbooks might still recall the dish and the times where it was a great comfort meal, but a lot of the new ones don't really remember it anymore. Now, how's that for a list of cheap dinners that would make the dusty night just a little better? Which dinner stood out to you the most? Let me know in the comments and don't forget to like and subscribe.